I'll explain myself immediately. I noticed a small misspelling in the title that I proposed for the problem of this conference, and I'll take the occasion now to change this title because of that, and not just because of that, simply because my text became a little bit more general than what the initial title suggested. Within this generality, suddenly the text is called Positivity, Negativity, and Literature's Marginality. Since we are kind of going out of time, I'll read very few bits of what I've written and talk a little bit, and then I'll stop. I'll read my introduction, then some parts in the middle, and I'll speak some parts at the end. First of all, one way of approaching the topic of marginality and literature is to ask about the marginality of literature. I pose the question of the structural place delegated to literature by the social logic of general distribution of value or whatever, together with the literature's own modes of pushing away from social zones of concentration, of dominance, from centers of power and power centeredness. A question that modernity and modern reflection on the arts and literature in particular has been in fact constantly asking. What is this mess of institution that is literature? We may start from the everyday intuitions about literature, intuitions that force on the experience with literature a double bind. On the one hand, we tend to consider literary activities, writing and reading, in the affirmative, positive, under the positive images of creativity and productivity. In modernity, literature has divorced itself from the demands of representation and has been formed as a pursuit of the new. This is, of course, an everyday perception. On the other hand, this pursuit also every day, in the everydayness, has been conditioned by a paradoxical counter-move, a negative determination of literary powers. Literature is predominantly a fictive, non-serious discourse. It doesn't do much or anything at all. Literary activities are self-voiding, unable to produce any real relevant effects. This double image, the active production of something and the active negation of production, in a sense, coalesces in the modern experience of literature. Returning now to the attempts at reflection on the significance of this double bind, this impasse. We generally find considerations of literature that tend to ground literature negatively. In the negative, literature is not, or misses something, or says no to something, and so forth. There is a talk about some kind of primary or originary negation that constitutes literature in our cultural realm. One such way is we find in Adorno and negative dialectics. One of the strategies of negative dialectics is to show that literature is kind of a negative statement towards reality, social reality as a whole, and as such it fails to actually completely extract itself from this whole, and by failing to be really effectively negative to this whole of this unity of our society, this totality, this failure is considered in a sort of sense as a positive event by Adorno, as an accomplishment through literature's negativity of the whole itself. So finally, with literature, the totality of social, well, of freezing of social relations is finally evident, actually. It's finally complete. So there is nothing more to be done in the direction of totality after this finishing up, this rounding up of totality through the failure of literature. This is one alternative. Another one we find in Blanchot. I'll skip Blanchot altogether and I'll focus on a kind of a third but option, which comes through a claim that it's essentially affirmative and negation is secondary always. Necessary secondary to affirmation, which is a claim that comes from within the context of this paper, within a commentary on Deleuze and his indebtedness to Nietzsche and his reading of Nietzsche is where I'll start. So, what is the case with affirmation, negation, the positive and the negative in Deleuze commentaries on Nietzsche will form certain notions about literature that are distributed through Deleuze's writings. First of all, and always, it's a criticism against dialectics in general. In Nietzschean philosophy, Deleuze describes bodies in terms of what they can do according to the quantities and qualities of forces that take hold of them. According to quantity, forces are dominant or dominated, and their quality, in their quality, they are active or reactive. According to they gain a quality of being active or reactive based on their quantity, that is, on being dominant or dominated. And the quantity of forces cannot conform to a pre-given scheme or be accounted for in accordance with the universal standard of measurement. It's not a quantity that can be measured through a certain arithmetical sort of model, and it has no standard of measure. It should be always singular difference, in a sense. Instead, it is dependent on a differential element that expresses itself in this quality, this quantity, difference in quantity, really, that gives the quality of being active and reactive. It's a three-way scheme here. This differential element is, of course, the will of power. So the will of power is the differential element expressed through these relations of domination and active reactive in two ways, as affirmative will of power or negative. That will be the basis for nihilism in Nietzsche, and what is called by Nietzsche nihilism, and the threat from nihilism in general. So, affirmation and negation are determined as primordial qualities of the will of power, expressed in the configurations of different, in quantity as well as quality, forces that happen to seize upon a body. Here, and this is of crucial importance, domination is divorced from its usual sense of governing, of control, since dominated force also can prevail over dominant forces without ceasing to be dominated, without losing its quality of being dominated, being reactive. Dominance here refers to power, not in the political sense this, as the, but rather as the capability to create, to impose new forms. This is Deleuze's expression, to impose new forms, to mutate the bodies that are taken hold of by the force, while experience and knowledge to, in a sense, the question of limits. What is to be taught within this question is the question of two types, two meanings of limitation, in a sense. In active forces, forces force a body to change, while reactive forces act upon forces limiting their activity of bringing a body to the limits of its change. So there is a limit of this drive towards limits, of limiting of self-limitation is what's reactive, what's problematic. Well, the positive thing, the positive active force is always considered in this achievement of a process of change that itself has gone through a limit, that is absolutely exhausted. Every form that a body can take is exhausted in the active, the positive, the affirmative expression of the will to power, while the negative one blocks and this changeability that goes through, this becoming that passes, traverses to the object, to the body, thus limiting the body to what it happens to be. It's simply this determined thing. This is the difference, so there is two senses of limitation here. Why is this important? Because this is also the way we can understand a very popular notion that comes from Deleuze and Guattari, the notion of minor literature, which according to them is an objective notion that can actually help us to understand all the talks about marginal literatures, small literatures at all. What is minor literature is discussed in their book on Kafka, and the most important feature there for what is for answer or what is minor literature is the fact that it engages in a minor usage of a major language. It's a question about usage of language, basically literature for Deleuze, and in general literature becomes some kind of experimental science of language, experimental linguistics that experiments upon the limits of language, of limits of becoming other linguistic bodies themselves. So this is what is at stake in this notion of minor literature. It's opposed to literature of masters. Its major literatures are literatures of masters. Minor literatures are minor uses of language. That's at least the initial attributes of that creates this distinction. Minor literature is not literature written in a minor language. In a sense, every language used normally, communicatively, is a major language. The lesson. So minor literature is not literature, Bulgarian literature in the sense of written the small or marginalized language that is Bulgarian language, faced with, for instance, English, but rather a certain specific usage of Bulgarian language that conflicts with its normalized communicative function. Minor literature is this usages of minor language that constantly produce effects of modification, variability, change within this language, Often Guattari and Deleuze use often the figure of creating a foreign language within one's own. And that's an illustration, basically. They connect this minor usage or explain with it the whole creative power of literature. That is, every literature that is in any sense inventive is inventive in this sense. It's a minor usage. So there is nothing major or revolutionary in literature except the minor. So it's like the minor has become old. This fundamentally creative power of the minor seems to work well within the already discussed difference between active and reactive forces, since in minor literature, language, this quotation, stops being representative in order to now move towards its extremities or its limits. So it's sort of grabbed by forces, active forces, that force it to change and change until it can no longer change, while a major language just leaves it as it is. It is just a stable usage. So it's the only way to think about this difference between major and minor here is through these notions developed through Nietzsche of the relationship between dominating forces and dominated forces, active and reactive, in the special sense that Deleuze gives them there, of not so much control or violence. Well, there is violence in dominating forces as well, but there is a good violence in dominating forces and bad violence of reactive forces that work on stopping on the active forces to do their work. So the question about literature becomes a question about how, in a sense, the normalcy of any language can be destroyed or made to become non-language, something outside of language, something different than language. And that is literature. Literature, according to Deleuze and Guattari, managed to do that by way of disruptions of sense, nonsense writing, and general agrammaticality or general disorder of syntax. Syntax is probably the most pointed way through which minor usage can be achieved. There is in Deleuze a metaphor extracted from Osip Mandelstam that, I paraphrase, that claims that literature forces language to stutter. Not us to stutter, but language itself stutters, and that's what literature is all about. And this stuttering, this creativity, which is strongly implied, strongly affirmed in the writings of Deleuze, is under the heading of minor usages, minor literature, and so on, always is presented through kind of very ascetic and negative terms. There is always talk about creativity, productivity, and so on, but always, in a sense, with a vocabulary that is ascetic, of isolation. For instance, Kafka is immediately political, Kafka's minor literature is immediately collective, and that's because he's totally outside, totally isolated, totally alone, totally unmoving, staying in bed, figures like that. It's especially effective and kind of obvious in Deleuze's talk on Beckett. And that's the final part of my presentation, a discussion of a text, very late text that Deleuze wrote on Beckett, on the late writings of Beckett, or rather not writings, but television plays, which is called The Exhausted. And it works entirely through this almost very negatively sounding figure of the exhaustion, and exhaustion of possibilities, which in fact is, gains further importance in a different context, in the context of a very famous now manifesto almost of what later was to become called postmodernism, the literature of exhaustion by John Barth, that also considers Beckett under this heading, under this figure of exhaustion. There's a sharing here figure, which actually is kind of introduced and developed in a very, very similar way in Deleuze and in Barth, but the difference here is of paramount importance. What exhaustion is it that they talk about? The exhaustion of possibilities. In this sense, exhaustion of emptying out of potentials. Absolutely. Because time is, always ends, and I need to just point on something important about this distinction. The exhaustion of possibilities in the lost doc of Beckett actually affords something, makes access to something, that's the question, that's beyond the position between possibility and realization. While in Barth, the exhaustion of possibilities are the exhaustions of sort of literary possibilities, an attempt to be original by, in a sense, ending literature, in a sense, by ending literature in a figure of nothingness. And there's this almost standard talk about Beckett's silences there as primarily explication of nothingness as a background to being, or something like that. In Deleuze, this figure of exhaustion actually affords something that is becoming productive outside of a simple relation between the positive, potential and its realization. So a potential must be exhausted, so something still potential can become visible, a force that works on a body that is not the body itself, can become visible, become sensed, the condition itself of something to be sensed can come to the fore. That's, in a certain sense, this figure of difference between shared between Deleuze and Barth kind of puts a very large question, and this is, of course, the question: is there at all reason to speak about something like postmodernism in art at all? Is there actually a fault that can be found in high modernism, in the sense that it is kind of faulty and kind of needs or has needed some transformation that comes and is named postmodernism. But returning to the initial question, in any sense, this relation of active and reactive, this differential forces in the loss that works through literature, that literature, in a sense, for Deleuze only makes possible for us to know or to experience, and art in general, not just literature, It's well, it's because it's kind of working against the grain, dissolving the normalcy, which is what's just the given and not the conditions to which the given is given. And here our ends. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. We have 10 minutes for discussing your questions, remarks, please. Please.
Thank you. Maybe I'll be asking you to say a bit more about what you left out. I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, the question of the link between the disaster
and the catastrophe.
But isn't there, I mean, to put it directly, isn't there a central problem with Deleuze around this kind of mob physics, quantity, being, as it were, entirely free of any kind of historical reference, whereas, as it were, to perhaps include the missing part, you know, if we're trying to think, you know, alongside Deleuze with Blanchard, where there's a reference to, particularly in the late work on the disaster, you know, to traumatic modernity in terms of exhaustion, which of course is arguably strongly there in Beckett. You know, think of Adorno and Beckett. He's the one who responds probably to Auschwitz. So the question would be, you know, what do we do about this kind of lack of history in Deleuze?
That's a very, very, very interesting question, and I'll be forced to answer very quickly that this is actually the difference between Deleuze and Blanchot, essentially, with this problem of disaster in Blanchot, that the disaster doesn't happen, cannot be expressed, and so on. Is the disaster itself. It's a problem that it can be described only in terms of effects of trauma and so on. While in Deleuze it's a kind of a permanent beginning or a constant initiation in a certain sense. The question about catastrophes, about this forcing something to shine behind the cliché in Francis Bacon and so on. The catastrophe there is chaos itself. It's the virtue in Deleuzean terms. It's basically the process of being. So it's definitely kind of against anti-historical notion, which displaces the question of history on a different kind of ontological level. History has nothing to tell us about disasters. The disaster is always kind of happening through the process of constructing the expanding the conditions that make history. The disaster is in the conditions, not in the condition. It's not historical conditions for disaster or something like that, but rather the other way around. Conditions that are, well, catastrophic in themselves develop always in history. There are some texts that actually move or kind of replace those questions in different directions, but especially in Thousands of Ghosts with Guattari, and Guattari himself has a lot of other things from what Deleuze uses to say about history. So this question cannot be simply untangled here, but this is definitely the difference between Deleuze and Blanchot here.